Hello, history scholars. Mrs. Olson here. This is part 3 of our video lesson titled The Civil War Begins. So let's go to our next slide, which is still titled The Opposing Sides. But we are going to talk about statistics regarding the North on one side and then the South. So in your notes, you might want to create something like a T-chart having the North on one side, the South on the other. So the first statistic that we want to talk about is the number of people that were living in the North. The population of the North came in at 22 million people, okay? And 90% of the nation's factories are located in the North. That is the majority of manufacturing capabilities that the North has. The South does not have this. Now, why is this important? Why is this considered an advantage to have more production capability? Here's your answer. If you have the ability to manufacture, to make, to produce war materials, food for people to eat, weapons, clothing, if you have those abilities, you are most likely going to win because you can always be resupplied. That's an important point to understand, okay? Now, the population of the South came in at 9 million, and they had half as many miles of railroad. This is considered a disadvantage because the railroad allows the side who has more railroad, it allows them to transport troops, transport goods, it's used for military traffic, and the South doesn't have as much railroad as the North. All right, so how does the North and the South make money? How do they finance the war? How do they buy all of these things in order to fight the war? Well, the North also had another advantage because it controlled the national treasury. It has the nation's money. Northern banks also held large reserves of cash, which they loaned to the government. So even though the North controlled the national treasury, you still have northern banks that are privately owned that have a large amounts of cash money. So think of green paper money, which they loaned to the government. There's not as much available cash in the South that they can loan to the Confederacy or that Southern banks can loan to the Confederacy, okay? And then there was a law that was passed called the Legal Tender Act, which allowed the government to issue paper money known as greenbacks, okay? I'm going to show you a picture of a greenback here in a moment, but we've kind of touched on this in that Southern banks, they had few reserves, so this is a disadvantage for the South. And the South also taxed their people, but the people refused to pay. So this is how the South was trying to get money to finance the war, but Southerners didn't want to pay the Confederacy. So the South didn't have as much money to finance the war as the North did. Okay, so the Confederacy decided that they would print paper money, and this caused inflation. Now, I want to talk about inflation for just a moment. Inflation is when money becomes worth less in value. So imagine that milk costs $3. A gallon of milk costs $3. If prices are inflated, that milk might cost $10 a gallon. It could be $20 a gallon. Crazy, right? But that's what inflation does. The more money that's out there without anything to back it, to represent it, it causes prices to go up. Printing more paper money never cures the situation. Okay, so here's an 1862 greenback, as you can see. And now we are going to come to the end of our lesson on the Civil War ends and talk about the political situation. President Lincoln's goal throughout all of this is to keep the Union together, to keep the North and South together as one America. Okay? Now, many Republicans who are actually in the North were abolitionists. They believe that it is that they want to abolish slavery. That's where their name comes from, abolitionists. War Democrats strongly supported a war to restore the Union, but they opposed slavery. Okay. And then we have peace Democrats who opposed the war, so they were against it. These guys were for it. And they wanted the unions to stay together through means of negotiation. So they don't want the country to go to war. So you've got these different sides that are kind of fighting against each other. Okay. The Republicans called this group, these peace Democrats, Copperheads. So here I want to show you that this is a Copperhead penny. Now, they called them Copperheads because they saw them as traitors to their own party. Copperheads are venomous snakes, and traitors are often called snakes as a negative thing. But get this. The Peace Democrats, or the Copperheads, began to accept the label as Copperheads, and they turned that negative name into a badge of honor. All right, we're going to change gears just a little bit and talk about the political situation in a different way. All right, so we're going to start with this term called conscription, and the definition of conscription is forcing people into military service. You might have heard of the word the draft. Now, the draft has been used by the American military to essentially get soldiers to fight a war. Now, we haven't used the draft for a long time, but there are certain wars throughout our history where conscription or the draft has been used. Okay, so that's one piece to things. Um, Now, we're going to talk about a phrase called habeas corpus, okay? President Lincoln suspends habeas corpus, so he doesn't allow habeas corpus to work. Now, the definition of this is that it refers to a person's right not to be imprisoned unless charged with a crime and given a trial. So you can't just be thrown in jail because somebody says that you did something wrong, right? We have to be charged by the police with a crime, and then we are given a trial to decide what happens to us. This is protected by the Constitution. Okay, here's more information on that. When the writs of habeas corpus are suspended, a person can be imprisoned indefinitely without a trial. Now, what you need to know is that Lincoln suspends the writ for anyone who openly supported the rebels or encouraged others to resist the draft or conscription. So, if you are going against President Lincoln's draft, or if you are supporting the people that you're fighting against, the South, then you can be thrown into jail and you don't get habeas corpus. It was his way of keeping control of the chaos that came from these different opinions. And he believed that these differing opinions were roadblocks to conversations, decisions, and peace. All right. So he has best intentions, but he's going against what all of us in the United States have to follow, which is the Constitution. All right. So this meme, I want you to read it. Then I want you to think about what you might say to President Lincoln about suspending the writs of habeas corpus. It means that people are not allowed to have freedom of speech. They're not allowed to help others that are going against the North. What would you say to President Lincoln about suspending what the Constitution protects? Okay, and now we end with what about Europe? Now, Southern planters agreed to stop selling cotton to European textile factories because they wanted the Europeans to recognize them as a sovereign nation, and sovereign means independent. Now, in the autumn of 1861, two Confederate diplomats, they set out to meet with European officials to get them to recognize, for Europe to recognize them as a sovereign nation. And it didn't work out the way that the South wanted. So the whole event is called the Trent Affair, and it ends with Britain and France choosing not to go to war against the United States. They don't want to get involved in the US Civil War. All right, now I know this is a little hard to read, but it is a political cartoon representing the Trent Affair. Britain is portrayed as the school mistress in the center, and America as a naughty boy to the right. And the question being, what is going to happen to America? And we're going to learn more and more about the Civil War in our next lessons. Please let me know if you guys have any questions. Bye.